This is the price of your loyalty. Take it and walk away clean, or stay and be destroyed with the rest of your dynasty.
The neon sign of the Sunrise Diner flickered with a tired hum, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cracked linoleum floors. It was 3 a.m., the hour when the city's desperation usually met its exhaustion. But tonight, the air in the corner booth felt heavy with a different kind of tension. Hyun-Jun Lee sat motionless, his tailored black suit an alien presence against the vinyl seat. He looked like a predator that had wandered into a trap and found it beneath his dignity to leave. Jenny Brown moved behind the counter with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had long ago traded her dreams for double shifts. Her apron was stained with coffee and the weariness of a life spent counting nickels to pay for her mother's dialysis. She had noticed the man the moment he walked in. People like him didn't come to the Sunrise unless they were looking for something they couldn't buy in a boardroom. She approached the booth, a pot of lukewarm coffee in hand. "Refill?" Hyun-Jun didn't look at the cup. He looked at her. His gaze was clinical, a cold sweep that took in her tired eyes, her steady hands, and the quiet, stubborn pride in her posture. "Sit down, Jenny," Hyun-Jun said. His voice was a low, melodic baritone that carried the weight of a command. Jenny hesitated, glancing at the empty diner. "I'm on the clock, sir." "Not anymore." Hyun-Jun reached into his breast pocket and slid a check across the laminate table. Jenny stared at the paper. The number of zeros made her breath hitch. It wasn't just a tip. It was a decade of work. It was her mother's health, a new apartment, and the ability to sleep without a calculator running in her head. She didn't touch it. "What is this?" "An investment," Hyun-Jun replied, leaning back. The fluorescent light caught the sharp angle of his jaw. "My father is a man of iron traditions. He believes the Lee name is a sacred bloodline. For years, he has tried to force me into a marriage that serves his legacy. I want to end that conversation forever." He leaned forward, his dark eyes narrowing. "I need a wife, specifically a wife who will make my father's heart stop the moment he sees her. I want you to walk into his estate, take my hand, and let him realize that his control over me has finally reached its limit." Jenny looked at the check again. The ink seemed to shimmer. "You want to use me as a weapon?" "I want you to use you as a statement," Hyun-Jun corrected, his tone devoid of warmth. $50,000 for one night of theater. You play the devoted bride, you endure his silence, and you walk away a wealthy woman. No strings, no contact after the sun rises. Jenny felt the familiar sting of her pride, the urge to throw the coffee in his face and tell him her dignity wasn't for sale. But then she thought of the stack of medical bills on her kitchen table and the way her mother looked when she was too tired to speak. She looked at Hyun-Jun, seeing the arrogance in his raised brow, the expectation that everyone had a price. She reached out and picked up the check. "I don't just want the $50,000. I want a dress that costs more than this diner. If I'm going to be your weapon, I'm going to be a masterpiece." A ghost of a smile touched Hyun-Jun's lips, the look of a man who had finally found an asset worth the cost. "Consider it done."
The transformation began not in a high-end boutique, but in the sterile, high-security atmosphere of Hyun-Jun's private residence. Jenny sat rigidly in a velvet chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching as a team of 3 women moved with silent, surgical precision around her. They didn't speak to her, they spoke at her, discussing skin undertones and fabric draping as if she were a piece of unfinished marble. Hyun-Jun stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to the room. He was a man defined by sharp edges and expensive silence. Every few minutes, the rustle of silk or the click of a jewelry box would cause his shoulders to tense, but he didn't turn. To him, this was a tactical maneuver. He wasn't dressing a woman, he was sharpening a blade. "Stand up, please," the lead stylist, a woman with a face as severe as a winter frost, commanded. Jenny rose, her legs feeling heavy. The transition from her grease-stained uniform to the weight of the emerald green off-shoulder gown was jarring. The fabric was heavy, liquid silk that felt like a second skin, cold yet comforting. As they cinched the waist and adjusted the flow of the skirt, Jenny felt her own identity, the girl who worried about rent and the morning rush, begin to slip away. "It is done, Mr. Lee," the stylist announced. Hyun-jun turned slowly. He had his critique ready, a list of adjustments to ensure the weapon was properly calibrated, but the words died in his throat. Jenny stood in the center of the room, the deep emerald of the gown making her dark complexion glow with an ethereal warmth. The off-shoulder tut highlighted the elegant curve of her neck and the steady, proud set of her shoulders. She wore a simple, delicate necklace that caught the light with every breath, but it was her expression that arrested him. She looked caught between worlds, confused, concerned, yet possessed of a natural, quiet dignity that no amount of money could buy. He had expected to see a waitress playing dress-up. He had expected a farce that would make his father sneer. Instead, he saw a woman who didn't just fit into his world. She looked as if she were born to rule it. "Well?" Jenny asked, her voice trembling slightly, breaking the suffocating silence. "Do I look like a wife?" Hyun-jun took a step toward her, his dark eyes scanning her from the hem of the gown to the crown of her head. For the first time, the clinical detachment in his gaze flickered. The raised brow of his usual skepticism softened into something more intense, more focused. "You don't look like a wife, Jenny," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly timbre that sent a shiver down her spine. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her bare shoulder before he caught himself.
"You look like a queen who has just reclaimed her throne. My father won't just be appalled, he'll be terrified." Jenny looked into the mirror, seeing herself through his eyes for a fleeting second. The fear was still there, lurking in the shadows of her gaze, but beneath it was a new, dangerous spark of power. The contract was signed, the gown was on, and the game had officially begun. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the most dangerous woman in the Lee Empire. Before I tell you what happened next to Jenny, don't forget to like this video, hit the subscribe button, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's dive into it. The black sedan glided through the winding hills of Bel Air, the engine a low, predatory hum that seemed to vibrate in Jenny's chest. Beside her, Hyun-jun sat in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. He hadn't looked at her since they left the penthouse, his gaze fixed instead on the passing shadows of oak trees and high stone walls. The emerald silk of her gown suddenly felt like paper-thin armor. The Lion's Gate was a massive structure of wrought iron and reinforced steel, flanked by two stone guardians that looked down with frozen, snarling faces. As the car slowed for the biometric scanners, the air turned cold. Security guards in dark suits, their earpieces glowing with a clinical blue light, circled the vehicle with the practiced movements of men who lived in the shadow of violence. "Listen to me carefully," Hyun-jun said, his voice cutting through the air conditioning. He finally turned to her, his expression unreadable, though his eyes burned with a sharp warning intensity. "Rule number 1, never look at my father for permission. If he speaks to you, wait 3 seconds before answering. Let him feel the weight of your silence. Rule number 2, do not let go of my hand. If you feel me squeeze your fingers, it means someone is watching for a crack in the facade. You must look at me as if I am the only man who has truly seen you." He paused, his gaze dropping to the elegant necklace resting against her collarbone. "And the most important rule, do not trust his kindness. My father, Sung Min, does not offer olive branches. He offers nooses. If he acts moved by your beauty or your grace, it is a trap to see if you are as soft as you look." Jenny swallowed hard, the reality of the lion's den sinking in. This wasn't just a party or a protest. It was a psychological battlefield where she was the primary target.
The car crested the final rise of the driveway, revealing the ancestral-style manor, a sprawling fortress of dark wood and white stone that seemed to exhale a history of secrets. "You're shaking," Hyunjun observed, his hand reaching out to cover hers. His touch wasn't warm, but it was steady, a grounding force in the rising sea of her panic. "I'm a waitress, Hyunjun. I'm not an actress," she whispered, looking at the formidable silhouettes of the Lee family associates gathered on the marble portico. "Then don't act," he commanded, his thumb tracing a slow, deliberate line over her pulse point. "Be the woman who looked me in the eye and demanded $50,000 without blinking. That woman is more than a match for anyone in that house." The car came to a final silent halt. A valet stepped forward to open the door. Hyunjun stepped out first, adjusting his cuffs, before turning to offer his hand to Jenny. As she took it, stepping out into the flash of security lights and the judgmental silence of the Lee Empire, she felt the transition finalize. The waitress was gone. The proxy bride had arrived. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Hyunjun didn't hesitate. He squared his shoulders and stepped into the light, his hand a steady, anchoring weight on Jenny's. The room was a sea of black and white, men in sharp suits and women in traditional hanboks or conservative evening gowns, all belonging to the upper echelons of the Lee Syndicate. As they moved down the short flight of marble stairs, the low hum of conversation died a sudden, unnatural death. Jenny felt the weight of 100 stares. They weren't just curious, they were clinical, assessing the intruder on the arm of the heir. She remembered Hyunjun's rule, wait 3 seconds. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her gaze fixed straight ahead, the emerald silk of her dress swishing like a warning against her legs. At the far end of the hall, seated on a high-backed chair that resembled a throne more than a piece of furniture, was Seung-min Lee, the boss of bosses, looked every bit the part, sharp-featured, silver-haired, and possessed of a stillness that was more terrifying than any outburst. He held a crystal glass of whiskey, his fingers steady, his eyes narrowed as he watched his son approach with the woman intended to be a scandal. Hyunjun stopped exactly 6 feet from his father. The silence in the room was so brittle it felt as if a single breath would shatter it. "Father," Hyunjun said, his voice echoing with a forced, icy calm, "I told you I wouldn't come alone. I'd like you to finally meet my wife, Jenny."
The expected explosion of rage didn't happen. Instead, something much stranger occurred. Seung-min Lee, a man who had stared down rival gangs and federal indictments without blinking, suddenly went pale. His grip on the crystal glass loosened and the whiskey sloshed over the rim, staining his hand. He didn't look at Hyunjun. His entire existence seemed to narrow down to the woman standing in emerald green. He stood up slowly, his knees appearing to tremble for the first time in his life. The associates nearby exchanged panicked glances. They had never seen the patriarch unsteadied. Seung-min took a step forward, his eyes wide and glazed with a sudden, haunting grief. He reached out a hand, his fingers twitching in the air as if trying to touch a vapor. "Yuna?" he whispered. The name was barely a breath, but in the vacuum of the silent ballroom it carried like a gunshot. Jenny felt Hyunjun's fingers tighten convulsively around hers, not as a signal, but in a rare moment of genuine shock. "Father?" Hyunjun asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Her name is Jenny. She's—" "Yuna," Seung-min repeated, his voice gaining a desperate, ragged edge. He ignored his son entirely, stepping into Jenny's personal space. His sharp eyes searched her face, looking past her confusion and her dark complexion, searching for a soul he thought had been lost decades ago. "You came back. After all this time, you finally came back to me." The room remained frozen, caught in the grip of a dead man's secret. Jenny looked at Hyunjun, seeing his mask of arrogance finally crumble into a look of pure, unadulterated dread. The weapon had been fired, but it hadn't hit the target they intended. It had struck a hidden door in the past, and as the old man reached out to touch Jenny's cheek, the air in the room turned cold with the realization that the game had just become a haunting. The tension in the ballroom shifted from a collective shock to a frantic, whispered energy. High-ranking associates, sensing a lapse in the patriarch's legendary composure, swarmed Hyun-jun like sharks sensing blood. They pulled him aside under the guise of urgent business, questions about a shipment in San Pedro, a dispute in Koreatown, but their eyes remained fixed on the center of the room. Hyun-jun tried to resist, his hand reaching back for Jenny, but a wall of black-suited men effectively cut the physical line between them. He was the heir, and the Empire demanded his attention, even as his gaze burned with a desperate need to get back to her. Left standing in the wake of the Yuna revelation, Jenny felt the air grow thin. The guests maintained a respectful, fearful distance, leaving her in a small, empty circle of marble floor with the boss of bosses.
Sungmin Lee did not move with the frailty of an old man anymore. He approached her with a slow, predatory grace that made the emerald silk of her dress feel like a target rather than a disguise. He didn't look at her with the disdain she had prepared for. Instead, he looked at her with a terrifying, intimate intensity. He stopped just inches away, close enough for Jenny to see the fine lines of age around his eyes and the absolute absence of warmth in his pupils. "You play the part well," Sungmin said, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. "My son thinks he is clever. He thinks he can use a stranger to mock our bloodline. He thinks he found a girl from a diner and dressed her in the skin of a lady." Jenny forced herself to hold his gaze. Wait 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. "I am not playing a part, Mr. Lee. I am exactly who your son said I am." Sungmin leaned in, his head tilting slightly toward her ear. The movement was so subtle it looked like a father-in-law sharing a private blessing, but his words were cold enough to freeze the blood in her veins. "The crescent moon," he whispered. Jenny froze, her breath hitched in her throat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "On the small of your back," Sungmin continued, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. "A silver of a personship, shaped like a sliver of the moon, hidden just above the hip. Only 2 people should know it exists, the woman who bore you and the man who watched her leave." The room seemed to vanish. The music, the clinking of crystal, the distant shouting of the associates, it all faded into a dull roar. Jenny's mind raced back to her mother, a woman who had never spoken of her youth, who kept a faded photograph of a different life locked in a cedar chest she never opened. Her mother had that same mark. Jenny had it too, a secret trait she had never mentioned to Hyun-jun, let alone a man she had met 10 minutes ago. Sungmin pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, a thin, ghost-like smile touching his lips. "You aren't just a weapon Hyun-jun found in a diner, are you? You are the debt he didn't know he owed." Before she could find her voice, Sungmin turned away, his composure fully restored, leaving Jenny standing alone in the center of the ballroom. She felt exposed, stripped of her fake identity, and suddenly terrified of the man she had been hired to fool. She looked across the room at Hyun-jun, who was finally breaking free from the associates, but for the first time, she didn't see him as her protector. She saw him as a man who walked her blindly into a trap 30 years in the making. The banquet hall had been transformed into a theater of forced civility. The air was heavy with the scent of roasted duck and aged soy, but beneath the savory aroma was the metallic tang of unspoken threats. At the center of the long, lacquered table sat Sungmin Lee, flanked by Hyun-jun and Jenny.
The rest of the Lee syndicate family sat in a rigid hierarchy, their eyes darting between the patriarch and the woman who had brought the boss of bosses to his knees with a single glance. Hyunjun was on edge, his posture a mirror of the sharp silverware beside his plate. He had intended this dinner to be a series of grenades, calculated insults aimed at his father's obsession with bloodlines. He leaned back, a glass of dark wine in his hand, his eyes tracking his father with a cynical smirk. "I assumed you'd have more to say, father," Hyunjun said, his voice cutting through the clatter of porcelain. "After all the lectures about suitability and tradition, I expected you to have an opinion on my choice of a wife. Or are you finally rendered speechless by your own hypocrisy?" It was a direct hit, a blatant provocation designed to spark the explosion Hyunjun had been craving, but the blast never came. Sungmin Lee didn't even look at his son. His focus was entirely on Jenny. With a slow, steady hand, he reached for a serving plate of galbi, selecting the finest cut of meat. To the shock of everyone at the table, he placed it onto Jenny's plate, a gesture of high honor in Korean culture that was usually reserved for a beloved elder or a favored child. "Eat," Sungmin said, his voice devoid of its usual gravelly command. It was soft, almost pleading. "You were always too thin. The kitchen prepared this specifically for tonight. They used the pear marinade, the one that was preferred." Jenny sat frozen, the emerald silk of her gown rustling as she breathed. She could feel Hyunjun's confusion radiating off him like heat. The rules they had practiced in the car were useless here. Hyunjun had prepared her for a war of insults, not this terrifying, reverent kindness. "My father is playing a game, Jenny," Hyunjun hissed, his grip tightening on his wineglass until his knuckles turned white. "Don't fall for the hospitality. He's trying to find her breaking point." "Be silent, Hyunjun," Sungmin said, not with anger, but with the dismissive tone one uses for a buzzing insect. He turned back to Jenny, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of recognition. "Do you find the tea to your liking? It is harvested from the same hillside in Jeju. I have kept a private stock for 30 years. I knew someone would come home to drink it." The Dinner of Thorns was living up to its name, but the thorns were digging into Hyunjun, not Jenny. Every time Hyunjun tried to steer the conversation toward the scandal of their marriage, Sungmin countered with a memory disguised as a question about Jenny's preferences.
He treated her like a returning saint, a ghost made flesh, while his own son became a ghost in the room. Jenny looked down at the meat on her plate, then up at the two men. Hyunjun was watching her with a raised brow, a look of growing curiosity and dread. On her other side, Sungmin watched her with a conspiratorial, mysterious look, his head tilted as if waiting for a secret password. She felt caught in the middle of a conflict she didn't fully understand, a pawn in a game that had shifted from a fake marriage to a deep, dark excavation of the Lee family's soul. She realized then that the birthmark Sungmin had whispered about wasn't just a detail, it was an anchor, and she was being pulled into the depths of a history she wasn't sure she wanted to survive. The heavy silence of the car ride back was a suffocating contrast to the sensory overload of the banquet. Hyunjun drove with a white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel, his jaw set in a line so rigid it looked carved from stone. Beside him, Jenny felt the weight of the emerald silk like a leaden shroud. The image of Sungmin's face, not the face of a mafia boss, but of a man seeing a ghost, haunted the dark glass of the windshield. "Who is she?" Jenny's voice was barely a whisper, yet it sliced through the hum of the engine like a blade. Hyunjun didn't answer. He accelerated, the needle on the speedometer climbing as if he could outrun the question. "Hyunjun, look at me,"
she commanded, her voice gaining the strength she had discovered at the dinner table. Your father didn't look at me like a disappointment. He looked at me like he was his entire world. He knew things. He knew about the mark on my back. He knew about my mother's tea. This wasn't part of the weapon you built. Hyun-jun slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as he pulled onto a deserted overlook. He turned to her, his dark eyes frantic, the calm, sophisticated mask of the Lee heir finally cracking down the middle. I don't know, Jenny. I don't know who Yuna is. He hit the steering wheel with the heel of his hand, a rare, raw display of emotion. I spent my life studying his enemies, his ledgers, his allies, but he never mentioned that name, not once. My mother, she died when I was 5. I thought her name was the only one that mattered to him. He looked at Jenny, his gaze scanning her face with a mixture of awe and dawning horror. I hired you because I thought you were the opposite of everything he valued. I thought your presence would be an insult he couldn't ignore. Instead, you brought him home, Jenny said, the realization chilling her. I opened a door, Hyun-jun whispered, his voice trembling. I thought I was in control of this game. I thought I was using you to gain my freedom. But the way he looked at you, that wasn't rage. It was recognition.
He reached out, his fingers tracing the air near her cheek, mirroring his father's gesture from earlier. If you are tied to his past, if my father believes you are some reincarnation of a woman he lost, you aren't a weapon anymore, Jenny. You're a target. The power dynamic between them shifted in the shadows of the car. The arrogant boss who had slid a check across a diner counter was gone, replaced by a man who realized he had accidentally ignited a fuse connected to a 30-year-old bomb. My mother never talked about her life before the States, Jenny said, her mind racing through childhood memories of hidden cedar chests and sudden, unexplained tears. She told me my father was a ghost. Maybe she wasn't lying. Hyun-jun leaned back, his breath coming in shallow hitches. The perfect plan had inverted. He had wanted to humiliate his father. Instead, he had given the old man the one thing he truly desired. We can't stop now, he said, his voice dropping to a low, protective growl. If we run, he'll hunt you down to find his answers. We have to go back. We have to find out who Yuna was before he decides what to do with the woman who looks just like her. The next night, the Lee estate was shrouded in a heavy, unnatural silence. Hyun-jun moved through the corridors with the quiet lethargy of a ghost, his heart thundering against his ribs. He had left Jenny in the car, the engine idling as a getaway vessel should the truth prove too volatile to handle. Using a master key he hadn't touched in years, he slipped into his father's private study, a room that smelled of old parchment, expensive scotch, and secrets that had been allowed to fester for 3 decades. The room was a fortress of mahogany and shadows. Hyun-jun bypassed the heavy desk, heading straight for the built-in safe hidden behind a landscape painting of the Han River. He didn't know the code, but he knew his father. He entered the date of his mother's death. Denied. He tried his own birthday. Denied. Finally, with a trembling hand, he entered the date of the anniversary they had just celebrated. The heavy door clicked open with a soft, mocking hiss. Inside, there were no ledgers of illegal trades or lists of rival associates. Instead, there was a single, weathered cedar box. Hyun-jun pulled it out, the scent of the wood hitting him like a physical blow. He sat on the floor, the cold marble seeping through his trousers, and lifted the lid. The first thing he saw was a photograph, its edges curled and yellowed by time. He picked it up, and the breath left his lungs in a sharp, painful rush. It was a candid shot taken at a bustling port, likely Busan, 30 years ago. In the center of the frame was a woman. She wasn't wearing an emerald gown. She was dressed in simple, utilitarian clothes of the late 80s, her hair pulled back in a practical knot. But her face, it was an impossible mirror.
The same almond-shaped eyes that held a hint of defiance, the same high cheekbones, and the same steady, regal posture that had stopped the room the night before. She was laughing, her hand resting on the shoulder of a much younger, humbler Sung-min Lee. The look on his father's face in the photo was one Hyun-jun had never seen in reality. It was a look of pure, unadulterated devotion. Her name was Yuna, a voice rasped from the doorway. Hyun-jun bolted to his feet, the photograph still clutched in his hand. Sung-min stood in the entrance, his frame silhouetted by the hallway light. He didn't look angry. He looked hollowed out, as if the secret had finally eaten through his armor. She was the daughter of a merchant in the port, Sung-min said, stepping into the room. He didn't look at his son. His eyes were fixed on the photo. She was the only thing I ever loved more than the empire. But my father, your grandfather, he saw a black woman as a stain on the lineage. He gave her a choice: disappear with enough money to survive, or stay and watch me be destroyed. Hyun-jun looked from the photo to his father. And she chose to save you? She chose her life, Sung-min corrected, his voice cracking. And yours. She was already carrying the child, my daughter. The world tilted. Hyun-jun looked at the woman in the photo, Jenny's mother, and realized the weapon he had hired wasn't a stranger. She was the sister he never knew he had, the living evidence of a father's greatest cowardice and the true heir to a legacy built on a broken heart. He wasn't just a boss anymore, and she wasn't just a waitress. They were the fragments of a family the Lee Empire had tried and failed to bury. The study felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of it, leaving only the scent of old cedar and the crushing weight of a 30-year-old sin. Jenny stood by the mahogany desk, her fingers trembling as she touched the yellowed photograph Hyun-jun had unearthed. Looking at her mother's younger face was like looking into a haunted mirror. The emerald gown, once a symbol of her transformation, now felt like a heavy shroud connecting her to a legacy she had never asked for. Sung-min Lee did not look like a mob boss anymore. He looked like a man trying to bargain with time itself. He ignored his son, stepping toward Jenny with a look of desperate, reverent hunger. You are her blood, the same eyes, the same fire. I spent 30 years building an empire out of spite because I couldn't protect her. But now the universe has brought back what was stolen. Hyun-jun stepped between them, his hand resting instinctively on his holster, though his expression was one of profound grief. She isn't a replacement for your regrets, father. She's a human being, and she's my— Your what? Sung-min snapped, the flicker of the predatory patriarch returning to his eyes. Your lie? You brought her here to mock me, Hyun-jun. You used your own flesh and blood as a pawn in a petty game of rebellion. He turned his gaze back to Jenny, his voice dropping to a low, seductive hum. But I am a man of business. I offer you a choice, Jenny. Stay here. Take your place as a daughter of the Lee house. I will give you everything your mother was denied. Wealth, power, a name that makes the city tremble. You will never have to work a double shift again. You will be the princess of this empire. Jenny felt the pull of it, the ease, the safety for her mother, the end of the bone-deep exhaustion she had carried for years. But she saw the hook beneath the bait. And if I refuse? She asked, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. Sung-min's eyes shifted to Hyun-jun, cold and clinical.
Then my son pays the price for his deception. To bring a fake wife into this house is a betrayal of our laws. To bring you here as a joke is a sacrilege. If you leave, Hyunjun will be stripped of his title, his assets, and his safety. He will be cast out of the syndicate with nothing but the clothes on his back and a target on his head. I will consider him dead." The room went cold. The stakes were no longer about a $50,000 check or a ruined dinner party. It was a choice between a gilded cage of blood and the destruction of the man who had accidentally saved her. Hyunjun reached out, his fingers brushing the emerald silk of her sleeve. "Jenny, don't," he whispered. "Don't stay from me. I'm the one who dragged you into this lion's den. Let him take everything. I'd rather be a ghost on the street than see you trapped in his shadow." Jenny looked at the patriarch, then at the brother she had only just discovered. The price of truth was higher than she had ever imagined. She was caught between a father who wanted to own her and a brother who wanted to set her free, both of them haunted by the same woman in a yellowed photograph. The choice sat before her like a poisoned chalice, and for the first time, the woman in green felt the true weight of the crown she had been forced to wear. The silence in the study was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of the Lee family's secrets. It was the sharp, electric stillness that preceded a storm. Sung-min stood like a monument to a dying era, his hand extended toward Jenny, offering a life of gold-leafed misery. He waited for her to submit, for the price of truth to force her into the same gilded cage that had broken her mother.
Hyunjun looked at his father, and for the first time in 31 years, the iron expectations didn't feel like a burden. They felt like ash. He looked at the man who had traded his soul for an empire, who was now trying to buy back his daughter with the very same currency. "The choice isn't hers, father," Hyunjun said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant calm. He stepped forward, not as the heir to a syndicate, but as a man who had finally found his own center. "And it isn't yours." Sung-min's eyes narrowed, the silver-haired patriarch's face contorting into a mask of cold fury. "If she walks out that door, you have nothing, Hyunjun. No name, no protection. You will be a ghost in this city." "I've been a ghost in this house my whole life," Hyunjun countered. He turned to Jenny, his gaze softening. He didn't see a waitress or a weapon or even a long-lost sister. He saw the only person who had ever looked at him without wanting something from the Lee name. He reached out, and this time there was no hesitation. He took Jenny's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in a grip that was as much a promise as it was a goodbye. "Let him keep the empire, Jenny. It's built on ghosts and shadows anyway. We're leaving." Jenny looked at the man who was supposed to be her employer, the man who had become her brother, and felt the final shard of fear dissolve. She turned her back on Sung-min Lee, leaving the emerald gown's reflection in the dark mahogany of his desk. "My mother didn't leave because she was afraid of you, Mr. Lee," she said, her voice echoing with a quiet, devastating power. "She left because she wanted a life that was real, and so do I." As they walked toward the door, Sung-min's voice rose behind them, ragged and desperate. "You'll have nothing. You'll be nobody." Hyunjun didn't look back. He led Jenny through the corridors of the fortress, past the silent security guards and the Lion's Gate that had seemed so invincible only hours before. The night air was cool and smelled of jasmine and California rain, a sharp contrast to the stale cedar of the study. They reached the car, but Hyunjun didn't reach for the driver's side door. He stopped beneath the streetlights, looking at Jenny. The woman in green stood before him, her dignity unshaken, her eyes bright with the dawn of a terrifying, beautiful freedom. "I can't give you the $50,000 anymore,"
Hyunjun admitted, a small, genuine smile touching his lips, the first one Jenny had ever seen. "I don't need it," Jenny replied, squeezing his hand. "I think I'd rather have a brother who knows how to walk away." Hyunjun nodded, the weight of the Lee name falling away as they stepped into the shadows of the city together. The Mafia boss was gone. The waitress was gone. In the space between their two worlds, they had found the only thing that was truly their own, a future they would build themselves.